Chapter 61 Ability Advancement. An adolescent. Nick repeated. Winter nodded. I am not entirely sure how he gains more power, but based on his behavior in the past, I would say that he becomes stronger by causing others fear or by just doing horrible things. I'm not sure about the specifics. Riker has been in the dregs for quite a while, and by now, he has amassed a gang with over 50 members. He has probably caused an incredible amount of grief, which should have given him a lot of power. I doubt very much that he's a hatchling. Nick looked with worry at Winter. Could he be an adult Spectre? He asked. Winter shook his head. Very unlikely. It takes a lot for a Spectre to grow. We have been feeding the Dreamer 24/7, and after months, it's still only advanced by 1.5 levels. If we keep going at this rate, it will probably take 3 years or so to turn the Dreamer into an adult Spectre. And that's considering that we keep feeding him with powerful Zephyx extractors. Nick, you have to keep in mind that something stronger also produces much more Zephyx. For example, if we keep sending in newbie extractors while the Dreamer is an adolescent, it would take over 15 years for it to become an adult. While Riker has a great reach, a lot of his terror is spread over his gang, and I don't think that suffering by proxy gives as much Zephyx as directly inflicting the suffering. At most, Riker is a late adolescent, and I'm already very generous with that evaluation. Most likely, he's an early or mid-adolescent, Winter explained. Nick just furrowed his brows. And we don't have a shot at taking him. Winter shook his head. Since the difference between realms is a twofold increase in power and since Riker is most likely an early adolescent, his physical power would be about 5 times as much as you, and that's only considering his physical power. He most likely also has an ability that is very useful in combat, which would make it extremely difficult to deal with him. Even if you could keep your ability perpetually active, you would most likely lose. Nick could only sigh when he heard that. So, we don't go after Riker just yet, Nick said. We don't, Winter repeated. But then what? Nick asked. We are out of ideas now. That's how all the Zephyx manufacturers feel, Winter told Nick. Getting the Spectres is always the most difficult part. Nick could only sigh. Guess that means that I have to go out and find a Spectre again. Sadly, yes, Winter said. We are still lacking the funds to create a full team of investigators. Nick sighed once again. Okay, he said. I'll do my best and look for a Spectre, but I'm honestly not sure where I can find one. Winter nodded. This time, our survival isn't dependent on your rapid success. Even if you don't find one immediately, we are still earning money with the Dreamer. If there is a deadline, it will most likely be when you are about to become a level 2 extractor. But that should still take a bit more than a year or two, Winter said. You mean the ability advancement? Nick asked. Winter nodded. I guess you're right, Nick said. I don't think the Dreamer would advance my ability in a very useful or meaningful way. What made the advancements between stages different from advancements between levels? Why was a peak level 1 Zephyx extractor becoming an initial level 2 Zephyx extractor far more meaningful than an initial level 2 Zephyx extractor becoming an early level 2 Zephyx extractor? 2 reasons. First, the increase in power was twofold instead of 1.5-fold. But more importantly, the ability of the person also advanced. By absorbing Zephyx, the extractor's Zephyx synchronizer would also become bigger, and eventually, it would become big enough to support a stronger ability. When one was ready to reach the next stage, one's Zephyx synchronizer would regain the ability to synchronize with a Spectre, but this new synchronization was different from the first one. During the initial synchronization, the extractor's Zephyx synchronizer would try to fully copy the Spectre's ability. But during the second synchronization, the Zephyx synchronizer would combine the new ability with the old one, creating a new one. For example, Winter had the ability of the blinding light, and if he were to advance by attuning his Zephyx synchronizer with the Dreamer, Winter's ability would transform. Maybe Winter's light would also cause hallucinations. Maybe Winter's light would make its targets tired. Maybe Winter would gain the ability to read the thoughts of his enemy while his ability was active. No matter what case were true, Winter's initial ability would remain the dominant one, and the Dreamer's ability would need to somehow fit into Winter's initial ability. Naturally, there were very compatible abilities and very incompatible ones. For example, Winter's ability and the Dreamer's ability were not compatible at all. One of them dealt with bright light and very noticeable attacks, while the other one was a very covert ability that relied on the element of surprise. So, what if Nick used the Dreamer to advance his ability? Well, in a certain way, the Dreamer's ability was quite compatible with Nick's ability since both of them used the element of surprise. However, they differed very much in how they were used. Nick's ability wanted to kill the enemy, while the Dreamer's ability wanted to manipulate or spy on them. Even more, both abilities would only be able to unleash their powers with the element of surprise but became useless after that. That was not what Nick wanted. The ability advancement was the best way to transform Nick's ability into one that could be used more than once in a battle. And the Dreamer's ability wouldn't help Nick in achieving that. Because of that, Nick needed another Spectre. And that was why the deadline for capturing the next Spectre was Nick's advancement to the second level, which would take 1 to 2 years. Competition. After talking with Winter for a bit more, Nick left the warehouse. Nick had already finished his session with the Dreamer today, and since he didn't need to interview any new applicants, he decided to fully focus on finding the next Spectre. However, that was easier said than done. Just like the last time, Nick had no idea where to find one. And this time, he probably wouldn't get saved by an inspector who wanted to help the general public. At least he had a lot of time. For the first time in quite a while, Nick returned to the dregs. He hadn't been here ever since he had gotten some food for Horua after Nick had caught the Dreamer. As Nick entered the dregs, everyone threw glances at him. Naturally, Nick was required to wear his Zephyx extractor uniform, which was why everyone was looking at him. The red and black colors on the high-quality uniform made him stick out like a sore thumb among the poor denizens of the dregs. Did anything unnatural happen lately? Nick asked one of the people looking at him from the side of the road. The young man with black hair just looked back at Nick with surprise. You mean besides the appearance of a Zephyx extractor? The man asked. No, not really. Nick nodded. I belong to Dark Dream, a new Zephyx manufacturer, and I have already dealt with a Spectre that was living in the dregs that was too troublesome for the other manufacturers. Please, tell me if there is anything suspicious that the inspectors told you not to worry about. The man blinked a couple of times in surprise and started to scratch the back of his head in thought. For about 5 seconds, he remained silent. I don't think I got anything of importance, the man said with an uncertain expression. Nick furrowed his brows. Are you sure? You don't seem sure. The man looked a bit uncomfortable. Well, there's something, but I really don't think it's the doing of a Spectre. Nick's gaze became solemn. Tell me. The man looked even more uncomfortable. You sure? He asked. I'm sure, Nick said seriously. Well, the man said. I've had diarrhea for the last week, but I didn't change my diet. Silence. And? Nick asked. That's it, the man said. Nick's excitement vanished, and he just looked at the man with a deadpan expression. Have you tried the Rust Lick? Nick asked. The man scratched the back of his head. Yeah, I think that might solve the issue. Thanks, he said. Nick released a sigh but nodded nevertheless. If anything pops up, tell me, he said. Of course, the man answered. Nick just turned around and walked away. He wasn't very bothered or angry. Back when he had been searching for the Dreamer, he had had conversations like this all the time. Life in the dregs was horrendous, and many times, people just took a Spectre's doing as natural. A Spectre's actions were horrible, and the life in the dregs was horrible. So, what was the difference? That was why people in the dregs often overlooked signs of Spectres. Since life was so shit here, people expected to have nightmares, which was why no one noticed the Dreamer. Since there were cruel criminals everywhere, people expected there to be horrible people, which was why no one noticed that Riker was most likely a Spectre. The Spectres perfectly blended into the dregs, which was why it was so difficult to find them here. Sadly, the outer city and inner city were completely free of Spectres since all the powerful manufacturers paid special attention to these places. Whether he liked it or not, Nick needed to find a Spectre in the dregs. Nick kept talking to more people, but just like the last time, he found no clues. At least, this time, the inspectors weren't making fun of him. Instead, the inspectors refused to talk to Nick besides superfluous and polite small talk. Nick now officially belonged to the competition. Every 2 hours, Nick went back to the hotel to check up on Horua, but these were his only breaks. For the remaining time, Nick kept wandering through the dregs while talking to people. When the day was over, Nick went to bed. The next day, he worked with the dreamer again, talked to Winter a bit, and went back to searching. This was how the next week passed. For over a week, Nick had been searching for a clue, but he just couldn't find one. By now, Nick had heard about all the mundane issues of the people, but none of them pointed towards a specter. Another week passed. Bang! As Nick walked through the dregs, he suddenly heard the sound of a loud explosion followed by the sound of something big collapsing. Nick noticed that a big building in the distance had collapsed, and he immediately charged into a small alley at the side. As soon as Nick entered the alley, his ability activated, and with one swift jump, Nick landed on top of a house. Bang! The metal below Nick's feet bent as he charged forward with all of his power. Within 20 seconds, Nick reached the building. Yet, he didn't like what he was seeing at this moment. Right now, there were 3 people standing in front of a big pile of metallic rubble. The person at the front was currently holding something in his hand that looked like a small worm with several tentacles growing from its mouth. Nick was 95% sure that this thing was a specter. However, Nick was also sure that he wouldn't get it. After all, the 3 people in front of the pile of rubble wore Zephyx extractor uniforms. Nick could only sigh. "You're late," the leader said, turning to Nick, who was still on the roof of a building. Nick was quite surprised that the extractor had noticed him. "Good luck next time," the leader said with a laugh. Then, he left with his 2 colleagues and the specter. Sound. Nick sighed. "That's one less specter I can catch," he thought. Naturally, Nick wasn't the only person searching for specters in the dregs, which made things that much more difficult for him. More days passed. Eventually, Nick found a clue. A small family told Nick that there were scary things happening in their house. From time to time, stuff moved around, and they even heard stuff shaking in other rooms. Some of them even claimed that they heard voices coming from below them, which couldn't be possible since the sewers were directly below them. Nick followed up on the clue and entered their house. After staying in their house for a while, Nick suddenly felt his ability deactivate, even though no one was in the room with him. But then, his ability activated again a couple of seconds later. Nick furrowed his brows and took a step forward in the empty room. His ability deactivated again. 3 seconds later, it reactivated. Nick knew what that meant. "Someone is hearing me but can't see me," he thought. Since Nick's ability deactivated if anyone sensed him, it also meant that it deactivated when someone heard him make a sound. At that moment, the person or specter knew where Nick was since they knew where the sound came from. But if they didn't see Nick and if Nick didn't give off more sounds, they wouldn't be able to perceive him again. After all, Nick could have already walked away from the spot where the sound had been made, making it uncertain for the listener whether he was there or not. "They can hear me but not see me," Nick thought. This either means that the specter is blind or that it is not inside the room. Nick very silently took a step to the side. His ability didn't deactivate. Then, Nick quietly opened a door. Usually, houses in the dregs didn't have any doors, but this one did. When Nick was slowly opening the door, his ability didn't deactivate. That means the specter is also not in that room, Nick thought, looking at the door he was opening. The next moment, Nick took a couple of normal steps. His ability deactivated again. 3 seconds later, it reactivated. After that, Nick silently crept over to another door and quietly opened it. His ability didn't deactivate. Means it is also not in that room, Nick thought. Nick scratched his chin. These are the only 2 adjacent rooms. The next moment, Nick grabbed an uneven spot on one of the metallic walls and pulled himself up. Ding! Ding! Nick quietly knocked on the ceiling of the room. His ability didn't deactivate. Ding! Ding! Nick used some more power. His ability didn't deactivate. Ding! Now, it deactivated. Means the specter is not above me as well. That knock was so loud that every adjacent room heard it, Nick thought. Then, Nick walked to one of the walls and quietly knocked at it. The same thing happened, and Nick's ability only deactivated after a pretty strong knock. After that, Nick tried the other wall. Same thing. That only leaves one spot, Nick thought as he looked at the floor. Slowly, Nick went to his knees. And then, he quietly knocked on the floor. Ding! Nick's ability immediately deactivated. Nick narrowed his eyes. In the sewers, huh? The next moment, Nick went to the rusty wall again and climbed it a bit. After that, Nick put his feet on the wall and looked at the ground. His ability had become active again. Boom! Nick shot at the ground, and as soon as he hit it, the metallic plates broke apart. The rusty plates couldn't possibly resist such a tremendous shockwave. As the entire floor collapsed, Nick's ability didn't deactivate, surprisingly. Although, that was actually logical. After all, with sounds of collapsing metal plates coming from everywhere, no one could tell where Nick was just based on sound. As the floor was collapsing, Nick rapidly took out a tube and destroyed it. Whoom! A bright domain of arclight appeared, encompassing the falling metallic plates. The dark sewer lit up, and Nick quickly found something that wasn't supposed to be there. Just 2 meters below where the old floor had been was some kind of scaffolding made of pieces of rusty metal. And then, Nick saw something else. There was someone on the piece of scaffolding. It was a middle-aged man, and he was in the process of ducking, which was quite understandable since the ceiling above him had just exploded. Bang! One of Nick's legs kicked one of the falling metal plates, shooting him towards the guy. Crack! Nick's elbow hit the guy's chest and pushed him toward the scaffolding, which broke apart as well. When Nick's elbow had hit the guy, he had felt many of his bones break, which told him one thing. That's a human, Nick thought. Sure, Nick had shot at the guy with quite a bit of power, but a Spectre wouldn't get injured this heavily as long as it wasn't an initial hatchling. Nick had just caused a genuinely life-threatening injury, which wouldn't have happened if this were a Spectre. Nick gritted his teeth in frustration. You idiot, Nick thought as he jumped away from the breaking scaffolding. The fact that Nick's ability hadn't deactivated meant that the guy was not able to perceive any other person right now. The guy probably couldn't muster the mental capacity for proper spatial awareness after having his chest caved in, which meant that he didn't know where Nick was. Nick grabbed one of the pieces of scaffolding that didn't break and threw himself back into the room at the top. Not all the plates had collapsed. As soon as Nick landed, he looked into the sewers. Splash! Several metal plates fell into the sewers, as well as the guy. Yeah, that guy is not surviving, Nick thought. The next moment, Nick just snorted in annoyance. What the fuck were you even doing down there? There are enough houses for everyone. Why would you live below someone else's house? Nick just kept looking into the sewers, which had calmed down by now. 10 seconds passed. Guess he lost consciousness. I am not a fan of killing people, but I'm not going to mourn a dumbfuck like that. Chapter 64 Profiting. Why was he even here? Like, did he live here? Nick thought. Probably not. That scaffolding was quite rickety and not very big. But then, what the fuck was that guy doing below this house? I mean, the tenants said that spooky things were happening in their house, which was most likely his doing. But why? I mean, did he do it on purpose? Based on what the tenants said, it had to have been on purpose. This means this guy was down here for a reason, and I don't think it's a very honest and nice one. In the end, Nick could only sigh. I guess the answer died with him. Splash, splash, splash. The next moment, Nick saw and heard several things entering the water. Nick raised an eyebrow when he saw a couple of rats swimming towards the place where the guy had fallen into the sewers. Thanks, Nick. Nick moved his head over the edge and looked at where the voice had come from. A rat was clinging to the ceiling, looking at him from about 2 meters away. 9 more of those, and I'll tell you where you can find a weak specter, the rat said with a smirk. Nick furrowed his brows and didn't answer. Oh, come on, the rat said. You've killed for less. A memory shot through Nick's mind, and an annoyed expression appeared on his face. Under normal circumstances, Nick would say that he would never consider the parasite's offer. However, he had been searching for a specter for 3 weeks now, and the latest clue had turned out to be just some random dude. Nick was quite frustrated and annoyed. For about 10 seconds, he didn't say anything. Meanwhile, the color of the sewers below Nick had turned a bit redder. I'll consider it, Nick said. Great, the rat said, excitedly clapping its little hands while keeping itself clinging to the ceiling with its hindles. I'm looking forward to it. Just throw them in the sewers. Nick snorted. Why was that guy even here? Nick asked. He was a stalker, the rat said. A stalker, Nick repeated. Yep. He kept rambling on and on about the love of his life and how he would make everyone leave the house so that he could be with her, the rat said. Total nutjob. Huh, Nick uttered in something that was and wasn't surprise at the same time. The next moment, Nick pulled his head out of the sewers again and stood up. Nick exited the room and walked out of the house. After exiting, Nick saw two people waiting for him. One of them was a middle-aged man, and the other was a 14-year-old girl. The man was quite muscular and burly, and based on the things he was wearing, Nick could tell that he was someone working for the peddlers, one of the four big gangs. Those two were the inhabitants of the house. Nick's eyes fell on the young girl. I guess that was his target, Nick thought. The next moment, Nick looked at the man. And with her father present, the stalker didn't dare to directly do anything to her. Guess killing someone isn't always bad. The burly man quickly came up to Nick with a nervous and scared expression. Surprisingly, his daughter didn't seem as anxious as her father. We just heard a loud bang. The father said, "Did you find the specter?" "Daddy, it's not a specter," the daughter said with a groan. "If it were, we would already be dead." "Let Daddy talk with the extractor, honey," the father said as he lightly patted his daughter's head. The daughter just snorted and looked to the side, but she didn't escape from her father's head pats. "So?" the father asked, looking at Nick. "It was a guy," Nick said. "A guy?" the father repeated in shock. "Told you it wasn't a specter," the daughter said with a prideful smirk. Nick nodded. "Some guy built some kind of scaffolding in the sewers below your house. When I knew that someone or something was below your house, I broke through your floor and found him." Many memories shot through the father's mind, and his fear and anxiety were very quickly replaced with pure rage. Some random guy was living below his house and causing him so much worry. "Where is he?" the father asked with a dark tone. "His scaffolding broke, and he fell into the sewers," Nick said. "The parasite quickly took care of him." The man snorted with aggression. "Lucky bastard," he grumbled. "Anyway, I have to thank you, sir," the man said with a respectful tone. "Without you, I would have probably lost my home." Nick nodded with a neutral expression. "If you ever find any information regarding any possible specters, please contact us. If you actually find one, you will have helped us far more than I have helped you today." "Of course," the man said, hitting his chest once to emphasize that he was serious. "I will tell my men to keep an eye out." Nick nodded again. "Good. By the way, you should fix the floor in one of your living rooms." "That's not a problem, sir," the man said with a laugh. "Thank you again." The next moment, the man pushed his daughter forward a bit. "Say thanks to the nice man, honey." The girl furrowed her brows, but her expression quickly turned into a friendly smile before politely bowing to Nick. "Thank you so much, sir." Nick nodded one last time and walked away. Some seconds later, Nick just sighed. "And the search continues," he thought with annoyance. 3 weeks. 3 fucking weeks. How long until I can finally get some clues for a specter? As Nick walked, his short conversation with the parasite shot through his mind. Nick walked in silence. 9 more corpses, huh? Nick looked at the sky with a thoughtful expression. Is it really that bad? I mean, there are plenty of people that deserve to die, right? Is it so bad that I profit from these deaths? Nick wasn't sure. Chapter 65 So difficult. Another 2 weeks passed. By now, Nick had been searching for a specter for around 6 weeks. And still, he had not gotten a single clue. There had been a couple of leads, but none of them actually led to a real specter. It was always just humans. Sure enough, the last time I was lucky, Nick thought with a sigh while taking a break in the marketplace. Even more, there was this second group of extractors that found a specter in the dregs. I feel like the other manufacturers find so many more specters than me. Although, I get it. They have investigators, while we don't have anything. How are we supposed to keep up with that? In fact, I didn't even find the specter myself last time. An inspector actually told me about the dreamer. Can I even find any specter on my own? Nick sighed again. 6 weeks with no leads. Nick looked at the people that were passing by him. By now, the people no longer avoided him. They had grown used to Nick's presence. At least I've gotten plenty of experience in how to find specters. I know which clues will most likely not produce any result, and I know how to get people to talk. On top of that, I learned a lot about what other people in the dregs do when nobody's around, and I even learned how the gangs operate internally. If there were any clues, I would probably be able to get them. Nick sighed once more. However, barely a day passes before one of the inspectors already finds the clue, and with their manpower, they can get to the bottom of the clue in no time. All the inspectors meet every day and gather their relevant information, making it much easier to create a full image of the dregs. Meanwhile, I can only look at a small part of the dregs every day since I am alone. I really need a team of inspectors. Nick just kept thinking about his current situation in frustration and hopelessness. He had no idea how to get another Spectre. Stop, please. Nick's eyes slowly moved to the marketplace. You don't want to have some fun. Come on, don't be such a prude. No, go away. Please. You can have my money. You can keep your money. I want something else. Nick just sighed. Another rape. In the outer city, sexual assault was illegal, but nobody really cared about this in the dregs. In a certain way, it might even secretly be encouraged since it produced more children, which produced more blood for Kugelblitz. Of course, nobody actually said that it was encouraged, but the absence of prosecutions for rapists still counted as a statement from the city. Rapes happened almost every day. It was a very common sight in the dregs. Everyone had gotten used to them, and the people just avoided the situation in the center of the marketplace. Right now, a younger woman was being beset by two guys. One of the guys was holding the woman's shoulder while the other one was grabbing his dick through his pants with a smirk. Nick had witnessed quite a lot of these events. Stop. This is my last warning. I will bite your dick off. The woman shouted as the guy was unbuttoning his pants. Oh, we got a feisty one, the other guy said, his pants apparently having gotten a bit tighter around the waist. Do you dare? The first guy said as he pulled the woman's head down. If you make me bleed, you will lose 2 liters of your blood. Can you afford that? The woman wrestled against her captor's hands, but she wasn't strong enough. You already look anemic, the other guy said, slowly moving his finger across the woman's very white skin. If you lose another 2 liters of blood, you will most likely die. Are you so against having a bit of fun with us? We are even willing to pay you 5 credits each. The woman gritted her teeth in anger, frustration, hatred, and helplessness. The people in the marketplace avoided her. If these 2 men were just random people, some of the others might have gotten involved. However, these 2 guys had the insignia of the Riker Strikers. While some of the bystanders were willing to put themselves in a bit of danger for their morals, they were not willing to commit suicide for them. After a bit more persuasion, the sexual assault commenced. Nick had grown so cold and apathetic to these events that he just absent-mindedly watched the woman's head bop back and forth on the guy's crotch in the middle of the marketplace. As Nick watched, a memory shot through his mind. He remembered his conversation with that one investigator who told Nick about the Dreamer. Back then, Nick had been furious with the Zephyx manufacturer because they didn't do anything against the Dreamer, even though they had the power and knew about it. They were willing to just sit by and let the people suffer. Nick had been absolutely furious with them back then. Wasn't he doing something very similar just now? I have the power to stop this, Nick thought, watching the crying woman. But would that change anything? They are the Riker Strikers, and they are known for going against absolutely everyone that resists them. Sure, I don't need to fear them, but that just means that they will focus their anger all on that girl. At that point, they will probably steal all her belongings and rape her a couple more times before dooming her to die during the next tax day. Intervening now would only make things worse for her. If I am going to interfere, her life is my responsibility since I would have indirectly killed her. The next moment, Nick looked at the guy who was pushing his cock into the crying girl's face. And if I kill them, I have to pay 5,000 credits per person. Sure, they wouldn't seek revenge on the girl anymore, but 5,000 credits is still a lot. I would have lost 10,000 credits just to save someone I don't even know. Even more, I wouldn't even get to keep the corpses, or I would need to pay another 10,000 credits per person, which means I also can't give them to the parasite. Nick sighed. Why is being a good guy so difficult? Chapter 66 Exchange. Nick kept watching the event in the middle of the marketplace. Usually, Nick didn't like watching something like this, but since Nick's current moral dilemma was related to this event, he just kept absent-mindedly watching. One of the 2 guys had noticed that Nick kept watching like a creep and became a bit embarrassed. Is he a voyeur? The guy that was currently in the process of having intercourse in public thought. Usually, one of them would charge at Nick and kick him a couple of times, but Nick's uniform stopped these thoughts from even occurring. Zephyx extractors were the absolutely worst people one could attack. Not only did they have an incredibly high status, but they could also tear humans apart like paper. 30,000 credits if I want to keep the 2 corpses, Nick thought as he looked at the 2 men. The guy on the side felt a cold shudder go down his neck as his dick became limp. Don't tell me that guy is gay. Nick just kept looking, deep in thought. 9 corpses would come to 135,000 credits, Nick thought. For 135,000 credits, I can find the location of a Spectre immediately. That's all I have to pay. Nick didn't even see killing these 2 men as part of the deal since that didn't have any relevance to him. Sure, Nick wasn't a big fan of killing, but if Nick really didn't like someone, that someone lost all their value in Nick's eyes. He had seen too much shit in the dregs to care about these people. Ah, there we go. The other guy shouted with a satisfied voice as he pulled himself out of the girl's mouth. By now, the girl was full on crying and fell backward with closed eyes. I think this isn't her first time, the guy said to his friend. She's surprisingly good at this. She does this amazing thing with her tongue. Yeah, I'm not interested, the other guy said as he looked at Nick with a concerned expression. I'm not in the mood. Not in the mood, the first guy asked in surprise. But you said you were into this sort of thing. I made you my rape buddy exactly because you were so into this shit. Don't tell me you've gotten soft. The other guy snorted. I got soft, but not in that department, the guy said. The next moment, he gestured to Nick with a movement of his head. He's watching, and it kind of ruined the mood for me. The first guy looked at Nick, and when he saw Nick's uniform, he also became a bit concerned. Why does he keep looking at us? He asked quietly. I don't know, the other guy answered. Think he's gay? No idea, dude. How long has he been looking? Since the start. The guy felt himself become a bit red in the face when he thought that a Zephyx extractor had been watching him rape a girl. He didn't mind the other people since he was very much into being perceived as powerful. When these weak people watched him without doing anything, he felt like he was establishing his dominance over all of the dregs. But when it was a Zephyx extractor, things were very different since he knew very well that he couldn't possibly compete with one of those. Because of that, he became quite a bit embarrassed. I get it, the guy said, understanding why the other one wasn't in the mood. Give me my money. The 2 of them looked at the crying girl. By now, she had opened her eyes, and she was glaring with hatred at the guy that had just raped her. When the guy saw the girl's aggressive expression, he became a bit angry and annoyed. He didn't like it when his prey bit back. Nevertheless, he took out 5 credits and threw them at the girl without saying anything. To the 2 of them, it was important to keep the good prey alive so that they could be reused, which was why they were paying them. At least the really good ones. The bad ones didn't get paid. The next moment, the 2 of them walked away from the marketplace. Nick just kept sitting at the side of the marketplace, still thinking about his options. How much longer? How much longer do I have to search for a Spectre? Also, just because I can't go against Riker himself yet doesn't mean that I can't get rid of some of his people. After all, I'm a Zephyx extractor, and Riker won't risk exposing himself by trying to take revenge on me. The death of a Zephyx extractor is a huge deal. In a way, I can make the dregs a better place while also profiting from it. 135,000 credits in exchange for the location of a Spectre and a better world. Nick nodded and stood up. Then, he left the marketplace and walked towards the outer city. For the next hour, Nick talked to Winter inside his office. Some hours later, Nick went to sleep. When he woke up, he dealt with Horua and worked with the Dreamer. After that, Nick left Dark Dream and entered a station where the guards of Crimson Fungus City worked. It was a black building with a huge symbol of Crimson Fungus City on it. As soon as he entered, the guards turned to Nick, and when they saw his uniform, they became interested. One of the officers walked over to Nick. Welcome. Is there anything we can help you with? Nick nodded. My Zephyx manufacturer requires some specific corpses from the dregs. I will be the one doing the killing and collecting. You just need to officiate the proceedings and help me transport the corpses, Nick said. Surprisingly, the guard just smiled politely. He wasn't surprised or shocked at all. Of course, the officer said. Please, leave your company's card here for reference. Nick nodded and took out Dark Dream's official bank card. The officer smiled politely, put the card away, and called a team of 3 guards. 2 of the guards came over to Nick and introduced themselves politely, while the last one walked to the back. Some seconds later, the guy came back out, pulling a hearse. Where to? The guy asked. The dregs, Nick answered. 67 Scary. Nick walked towards the dregs while 3 of the guards kept following him. 2 of the guards were rather tall and wore black uniforms, similar to the uniforms of the tax collectors but without the gas masks. The entire gas mask thing for the tax collectors mainly existed to keep their identities secret and so that they didn't need to smell the disgusting dregs. Normal guards didn't wear gas masks. But right now, they wish they did. As soon as they walked into the dregs, the faces of the 2 guards behind Nick scrunched up while the 3rd guard far behind them just sneered in disgust. The outer city had a solid wall of metal between itself and the sewers, but the dregs were mostly built on rusty grates. One could imagine how bad it smelled to walk over something like the sewers of Crimson Fungus City. As soon as they entered, the eyes of the people opened widely in horror. If there were simply a couple of guards with a Zephyx extractor, they wouldn't care. However, the hearse was what scared them. The people immediately scattered, not even entering the houses but just running as far away as possible. The guards just casually watched the people scatter. The Zephyx extractor had said that he would be the one creating the corpses. Want us to stop them? One of the guards asked as a formality. No, Nick answered neutrally. As you wish, the guard answered before becoming quiet again. As Nick walked through the dregs, he felt strange. At this moment, he no longer felt like a member of the dregs. In fact, he felt like one of the tax collectors. For some reason, Nick felt like he was not looking at humans running from him but at animals. This feeling scared him. He felt like he was losing something important, and he quickly shook his head. Stop thinking about these things. Nick thought with frustration. You're about to make this a better place. You're about to take care of some people from the Riker strikers. The people are running from you only because they don't trust you and don't know if you will kill them. If they knew what you were doing, they would look at you with thankful eyes. However, it wasn't easy to get rid of this strange feeling. Even though Nick knew that what he was doing was for the good of the dregs, he still felt like some kind of monster. Eventually, the 4 of them reached the marketplace. It was empty. Naturally, everyone had already heard about the group of people coming, and they had already scattered like roaches. It didn't matter what power one had in the dregs. Children, adults, merchants, rapists, murderers, gang members, or whatever. Everyone was equally helpless when the guards or Zephyx extractors came. Nick led the 3 guards past the marketplace into a relatively small alleyway. The alleyway was so small that the hearse didn't even fit into it. You can leave it here, Nick said, turning to the guy pulling the hearse. The guard just nodded and waited at the entrance of the alleyway with his hearse. A moment later, he took out a small azure bottle. Really, Johnny? One of the guards asked with annoyance. We're working right now. The guard gritted his teeth and put the bottle into his pockets again. Sorry, boss. Johnny, you really need to keep this addiction under control. I don't want your performance to suffer. Don't worry, boss. I know. Sorry, the guard said. The other guard sighed and turned to Nick. Sorry for this. It's fine, Nick said as he led the 2 guards deeper into the alleyway. When they were gone, Johnny took out the azure bottle again and unplugged it. The next moment, he bit down on a part of his lower lip so hard that it started bleeding. Then, he put one of his fingers into the bottle and carefully took out some blue dust, which he then placed on the bleeding part of his lip. His body started to shake in place, and a pained expression appeared on Johnny's face. Yet, there was also deep happiness visible on his face. A minute later, he stopped shaking. Creakish. He bit his lip again and put another bit of blue dust on it. Meanwhile, Nick led the 2 guards behind him to an unnoticeable wall of a seemingly random building. Nick pushed on it a bit, but it didn't move. This was the entrance to the Riker Strikers headquarters. Naturally, after gathering information in the dregs for over 6 weeks, Nick had learned where the headquarters of all the different gangs were. Locked, Nick thought emotionlessly. Step back, Nick said. The 2 guards took a couple of steps back. Turn around. I don't want to show you my ability, Nick added. The 2 guards looked at each other but turned around after. There was no reason for Nick to kill them. After staying silent for a couple of seconds, Nick felt his ability activate. Since Nick was a late newbie, his body was about 3.4 times as powerful as the average human male, and with his ability active, it was around 17 times as powerful. If he wanted, Nick could lift a stone that weighed over a ton over his head. But instead, Nick grabbed the side of the plate and pulled with all his power. CRRRRK. The screws and nails exploded off the plate, and the plate was thrown to the side. The sound was extremely violent and loud, and when the guards heard it, their entire bodies jerked in shock. It sounded like something huge had just broken through a metallic wall. The two of them quickly turned around, but they just saw Nick standing in front of an open corridor. When the two of them saw the many small holes in the wall and the bent metallic plate on the side, they took deep breaths through their teeth. They couldn't do something like that. Even though they were guards, they were still just humans. Once more, they were reminded of how scary Zephyx extractors were. Creating corpses. Nick just gestured towards the open corridor with his head and entered. The two guards took another deep breath and followed him. Luckily, the Zephyx extractor was not their enemy. Shortly after entering, two tall men walked out of one of the doors at the side of the corridor. Based on their lack of clothing, Nick could tell that they had probably been asleep until now. What the F? Bang! Before the first guy could finish speaking, Nick casually extended his hand to his face and shoved his head into the metallic wall. Crack! The loud sound of something hard cracking echoed throughout the corridor, and the other guy's eyes widened in terror. He immediately took out a long metallic pipe and lifted it in front of him in terror. Nick quickly arrived in front of him and grabbed the pipe. The man felt like a giant was pushing the pipe to the side. The next moment, Nick grabbed the guy's shoulder and shoved him to the ground. The man couldn't even resist. The man was quite big and powerful by the Dregs standards, which meant he was about 85 kilos with a low body fat percentage. That put him at a bit above average for normal human standards. And Nick? Well, if one were to use the guy as a reference, Nick would be a man weighing about 240 kilos with a low body fat percentage. That was an amount of muscle that nearly no normal human had ever accomplished in their life. Maybe after a lifetime of brutal training while being over 210 centimeters tall. And yet, all of that power was condensed into a frame that was barely 175 centimeters tall. Without thinking much about it, being 3.4 times as powerful as an average man didn't seem that impressive, but when put into actual numbers, it was actually a terrifying amount of power. As soon as the man was pushed to the ground, Nick grabbed the man's head and twisted it until he heard several violent cracks. Nick wasn't used to killing people, but he knew that he just needed to create enough cracks at important places to kill someone. Nick grabbed one of the guys and casually threw the body towards the entrance. The two guards sidestepped the body as they looked at it with lifted eyebrows. "Keep an eye on them," Nick said. Sure," one of them said absent-mindedly as he kept looking at the body beside his feet. Nick nodded and went into one of the rooms where one of the guys had come out. Inside, Nick saw a couple of bunk beds. On one of the beds, Nick saw a guy rubbing his head in annoyance before looking towards the door. Nick walked towards the bunk bed as the eyes of the guy followed him in confusion. With a jump, Nick jumped on top of the bunk bed, his two hands surrounding the guy's neck. Then, Nick squeezed. Nick felt several pops with his hands as the man's expression became terrified. The man's hands and feet tried to punch and kick Nick, but the man felt like he was hitting a wall. In a last-ditch effort, the man tried to reach for Nick's eyes, but Nick just moved his head out of the way until the guy went limp. Just to make sure, Nick twisted the head of the guy until there was nearly no resistance anymore. Killing someone wasn't difficult if one had a lot of physical strength. Then, Nick heard some clamoring and saw someone jump out of one of the beds, bolting for the door. Bang! The bunk bed Nick was kneeling on exploded as he shot toward the person. The man barely managed to get out of the door before Nick managed to grab his arm, at which point the guy was pulled back into the room. Again, Nick just bent the guy's head until it lost its connection to the neck. Since there was no one else running away, Nick threw the two bodies to the entrance under the interested gazes of the two guards. Next, Nick went back into the room and looked at it more closely. No, please. Bang! When Nick opened one of the closets, he found a man cowering and screaming in it. A kick to the face silenced him quickly. To make sure, Nick cracked the neck of the guy a bit. That had been the last person in the room. After throwing that corpse onto the other corpses, Nick entered another room. This room also had 3 bunk beds, but Nick saw nobody in them. He looked around a bit and didn't see any other exit out of the room. Crack! Nick closed the door and bent the door hinge until the door couldn't be opened anymore. Then, he began to search the room. He found a guy under a bed. A kick and a crack silenced him. When Nick opened one of the closets again, he saw a terrified man cowering on the ground. Surprisingly, the man neither moved nor screamed. He was just looking at Nick with widely opened eyes. Nick slowly moved his hand towards the guy's head as he watched Nick in terror. Bang! After ramming the guy's head on the side of the closet, Nick separated the neck from its skull again to make sure. A minute later, Nick finished looking through the room. There was nobody else. But then, Nick furrowed his brows. Right now, Nick silently stood in the middle of the room. Yet, his ability hadn't reactivated. Nick moved around the room a bit and stopped for 3 seconds at seemingly random locations. Sometimes, Nick's ability reactivated before deactivating again. Eventually, Nick looked up. There was a rusty grate above him. Nick jumped up, grabbed the grate, and pulled it out of the ceiling. Immediately, Nick heard frantic sounds coming from above him. When Nick's head entered the new hole in the ceiling, he saw a guy trying to crawl away in some kind of ventilation shaft. After going into the shaft, Nick grabbed the man's feet and pulled him back. Help me. The man's nails broke off as he desperately tried to stop himself from getting pulled backward, leaving bloody lines on the walls. Some seconds later, the door to the room exploded, and Nick threw the corpses into the corridor. The guards looked at the corpses with neutral expressions and pulled them to the other ones. I need one more, Nick said neutrally before going deeper into the hideout. Right thing. A minute later, the body of a young man was thrown onto the corpse pile by Nick. All right, I'm done, Nick said as he released a sigh. The leading guard nodded. You want to keep the corpses, right? He asked. Nick wordlessly nodded. All right, we'll put them on the hearse and calculate the price back in the outpost, he said. Nick nodded again as he walked past them. When Nick exited the corridor, he looked back. He saw one of the guards putting one of the corpses on the shoulders of the other guard, but Nick wasn't consciously taking note of that. Right now, Nick's thoughts were completely elsewhere. I did the right thing, right? Nick thought. The Riker Strikers are a horrible gang that rape and kill people all the time without contributing anything. The hub brings a lot of jobs and keeps the gangs in check. The peddlers are the reason why there are so many people in the dregs in the first place, since they bring in a huge portion of the food. The insurance gang gives people a way to protect their belongings from others. All of them contribute to the dregs. But the Riker Strikers don't contribute anything. They just steal, rob, rape, and murder. At that moment, one of the guards walked past Nick with one of the corpses on his shoulders. Nick didn't look at the corpse, but he felt like the corpse was looking at him with its widely opened and dead eyes. Nick's mind replayed the things he had seen inside the corridor. Screaming people, terrified people, and yet, Nick only felt like he had gotten rid of some pests. They obviously were people, but Nick only viewed them as roaches or rats. In a way, these people were even worse than rats and roaches, since those could actually be eaten. Nick felt like he was supposed to feel more. They were still humans, right? Wasn't he supposed to feel something while killing humans? At that point, Nick was reminded of the first time he had killed someone. When Nick was just 13, he had been close to starving, and due to sheer luck, he somehow managed to kill a rat. When Nick had just taken his first bite, a gruff and tall woman pushed him away and grabbed the rat. At that moment, Nick had been filled with panic, and he had used all his power to push the woman when she had turned her back to him. Surprisingly, the woman had been sent flying, and she landed on a very rusty grate, which broke. A moment later, she screamed in terror as she fell into the sewers. The young Nick just looked with terror at the hole in the ground. He didn't dare to look into it. He only heard the sounds of many smaller things also falling into the water and the woman's screams becoming shriller and hoarser. Soon, the screams vanished, and a minute later, a rat walked out of the hole. Thanks, the rat said with a smirk as it stopped in front of Nick. You can have this body as a reward. If you ever need food, you can just throw another person into the sewers. And then, the rat just collapsed. The following days had been the most horrible of Nick's life. Sleeping had become extremely difficult. Eating had become difficult. Working had become difficult. Living had become difficult. Nick had been haunted by his memories of that day for weeks. Yet, in a certain way, the memories had helped him. Nick had feared confronting the memories so much that he had become active during every waking moment. He feared the silence that allowed him to think and did everything to avoid it. This resulted in Nick's body becoming stronger and in him getting more money by working more. And eventually, Nick had learned to live with everything. Finally, when Nick had finished his third assassination mission from the hub, he had made his peace with that event. Nick had never been a fan of killing, but he needed money to survive and to build a future, which was why he had accepted these missions. It was something that he simply had to do and get through. Beggars literally couldn't be choosers. "Sir, we're done." Nick was pulled out of his memories as one of the guards called him. He turned to the entrance of the alleyway and saw the hearse completely filled. The next moment, Nick threw one last glance at the entrance of the corridor. "I did the right thing," he told himself in his mind. After shaking his head to regain his bearings, Nick went to the hearse. "Let's return," he said. "Of course, sir," the leading guard said. By now, the second guard had joined the third guard in pulling the hearse since it had become quite a bit heavier. The four of them traveled through the dregs in absolute silence. They didn't speak, and nothing in their vicinity made any noise. It was almost like they were traveling through a ruin. Eventually, they entered the outer city. More people appeared on the streets, but when they saw the hearse, they just held their noses and avoided walking near the hearse. A couple minutes later, the four of them arrived at the outpost of the guards. The hearse was parked outside the entrance while the four of them entered. Nick was led into a separate office, and the leading guard took out several sheets of paper. After reading all the sheets of paper and explaining them to Nick, the guard gave Nick a couple of them to sign. Nick signed all of them, and the guard put them away. "And that's all. Thank you, sir," the guard said with a polite smile. Nick nodded and stood up. "Thank you. As well. No thanks necessary. Just doing my job." Nick nodded again and left the office. "Please, bring back the hearse by tomorrow," the leading guard shouted before Nick closed the door. After exiting the outpost, Nick looked at the hearse filled with bodies. Some seconds later, he wordlessly took hold of the hearse and began to pull. Chapter 70 Sustainable Help. As Nick traveled through the outer city, people kept avoiding him due to the hearse he was pulling. A couple of minutes later, Nick arrived in front of Dark Dream's warehouse and entered through one of the big gates. The sound of the rusty wheels echoed throughout the entire warehouse. Just when Nick put the hearse down, the door to Winter's office opened. It was barely 5 p.m., and Winter was still here. When Winter saw the hearse with the leaking blood, he took a deep breath, but he didn't let Nick see it. Even though Winter had been raised to become a ruthless businessman, seeing a small hill of corpses was still shocking to him. Winter slowly walked over and stopped 2 meters away from the hearse as Nick stepped to the side. "They are all members of the Riker Strikers?" Winter asked. Nick nodded. "They were all staying in the headquarters, and they are all pretty muscular and big." Winter absent-mindedly nodded as he kept looking at the hill. "And you're sure Riker won't take revenge?" "You were the one that assured me he wouldn't," Nick answered. Winter took another deep breath. "Right, sorry," he answered absent-mindedly before looking away from the hearse. "This is a good thing," Nick said, looking at Winter. "The Riker Strikers are a plague upon the dregs." "Nick," Winter said with a slightly annoyed tone. "Don't be disingenuous. We killed them for money. Nothing more and nothing less." When Nick heard that, he narrowed his eyes. "Maybe that's true for you, but I genuinely care about the dregs. If the Riker Strikers weren't such a massive nuisance, I would have never killed them." "And then what?" Winter asked. "Yes, you wouldn't have killed anyone else, but that's only because not enough time has passed." Nick wanted to protest, but he didn't interrupt Winter. "You've searched for 6 weeks with no results, and you grew desperate. If the Riker Strikers didn't exist, you wouldn't have killed anyone. But what after another 4 weeks or another 10 weeks? When would you have become desperate and frustrated enough to kill people from another gang?" Winter asked. "Winter, you're evaluating me with your standards," Nick answered. "I have killed people before, but only when it was necessary or when there was a good reason. I am richer than 95% of all people living in the outer city, and I am well on my way as a Zephyx extractor. Acting like I need to kill someone to survive while having this much wealth is something I can never accept," Nick explained. "And yet, you just killed 9 people, Winter countered. "Because I finally have the power to make a difference," Nick answered with a dark voice. "I am finally rich and powerful enough to change the lives of others for the better." Winter, My goal is not to just become fat and rich but to improve the lives of the people around me, Nick argued. Since when? Nick furrowed his brows. What do you mean since when? Since when? Winter repeated. When we were on the search for the dreamer, you told me that you just wanted to have a better life. You never said you wanted to improve the lives of the people around you. Silence. Surprisingly, Nick didn't immediately answer. Since when, huh? Nick repeated as he looked up with furrowed brows. Winter didn't interrupt Nick's thoughts. Nick thought back to his 3 days of vacation with Horua. Back then, Nick's goal hadn't been to improve the lives of other people. When Nick had worked with the dreamer, he also hadn't thought about the lives of others. When Nick had been searching for the next Spectre, he also hadn't thought about others. And yet, I feel like I want to change things, Nick thought. I feel like I should do something to improve the general quality of life of the people in the dregs. When did that happen? Silence. Eventually, Nick reached an answer, but he didn't like it. When I decided to kill the Riker Strikers, Nick thought. That was when I made my choice. Nick looked down. Is Winter right? Am I just saying this because I want a justification? I was growing frustrated, and when the frustration hit a high point, I suddenly found a solution to my frustration while also conveniently finding a moral justification. What if I wouldn't have gained anything out of this? What if I weren't allowed to keep the corpses? Would I still have done this? Silence. Nick kept thinking. As things are now, no. However, that's because of the price for killing them. I want to help the people, but 5,000 credits to kill a person is just too high of a price. If I wouldn't need to pay 5,000 credits for every person I kill, I genuinely believe I would kill the Riker Strikers to improve the dregs. Yes, I want to improve the lives of others. I always lamented that so many powerful people didn't give a shit about improving the world and just kept consuming more and more to become fatter and fatter while we poor people suffered. I always wanted to change things, but I never felt like I had the power. But now, I am slowly attaining this power. I refuse to become one of these people who forget their past struggles. I refuse to have this mindset that, since I am now the one in power, I have a moral justification to do the same thing that has been done to me in the past to others. I will improve the lives of others. The next moment, Nick narrowed his eyes and looked at the hearse. But it has to be sustainable. If I can't keep my power, I lose the power to help others. The stronger I get, the more people I can help. But it's important that I never lose this mindset. The next moment, Nick turned to Winter. Thanks, I needed that. Winter just raised an eyebrow. He wasn't quite sure what Nick meant. If you enjoyed the audio, please